630 feet above the Mississippi River, a perfect arc of stainless steel catches the afternoon light. The gateway arch rises against the sky like a monument to everything America believed it could become. From a distance, it looks triumphant, permanent, a silver promise frozen in midair. But beneath that gleaming curve lies a different story. Walk the streets below the arch, and the silence feels wrong. These downtown blocks were built for hundreds of thousands. Now they echo with the footsteps of hundreds. Vacant office towers stand with windows dark. Streetcars run nearly empty through corridors where crowds once moved like rivers. The grand department stores are gone. The bustling riverfront is quiet. Block after block, the architecture speaks of ambition that outlived the city it was meant to serve. The arch itself was built as a monument to westward expansion, to St. Louis as America's great gateway. But construction began in 1961, decades into the city's long decline. By the time it opened in 1967, St. Louis had already lost a third of its population. The monument rose as the city fell. There was a time when St. Louis rivaled Chicago for control of the American interior. It commanded the rivers. It hosted the world at the largest fair in history. It built civic monuments meant to last 1,000 years. Millionaires raised mansions. Immigrants poured in by the tens of thousands. The future seemed limitless. How does a city with every advantage become a hollowed shell? How does a gateway become a dead end? The answer lies not in a single catastrophe, but in a slow unraveling that turned promise into ruin. Chapter 1: The River's Promise. The story begins in February 1764, when two French fur traders stepped onto a limestone bluff overlooking the Mississippi River. Pierre Laclede Liguest and his young assistant, Auguste Chouteau, had been searching for the perfect location to establish a trading post. When they saw this spot, 15 miles below, where the Missouri River joined the Mississippi, they knew they had found it. Laclede reportedly declared that the site would become one of the finest cities in America. He was looking at mud, forest, and water. But he understood what others would take decades to grasp. Geography is destiny. The man who controlled the junction of these two rivers would control the commerce of half a continent. They named the settlement after King Louis IX of France. By summer, the first rough cabins stood along the riverbank. French trappers arrived with canoes loaded with beaver pelts. The settlement grew slowly at first, a collection of vertical log houses arranged along narrow streets that climb from the water's edge. This was the western edge of the known world, where European ambition met indigenous land. The territory changed hands like currency. In 1770, Spain took control, though French culture remained dominant. The Spanish governors ruled from New Orleans, but left the fur traders of St. Louis largely alone. The residents spoke French, built in the French style, and traded French goods up and down the rivers. Native American tribes brought furs to exchange for iron tools, cloth, and weapons. The Osage, the Missouri, the Sac and Fox nations had traveled these waterways for centuries. Now they watched as European settlements spread along the banks. What happened next was the pattern that would repeat across the continent. Treaties were signed and broken. Tribal lands were purchased for fractions of their value or simply taken. The indigenous populations who had sustained themselves along these rivers for generations were pushed westward, then pushed again. Diseases introduced by European contact decimated communities. The rivers that had once belonged to everyone became owned, controlled, taxed. By the time St. Louis reached its height, the original inhabitants of the region had been removed entirely, displaced to reservations hundreds of miles away, or absorbed into settlements where their presence was barely acknowledged. In 1803, the entire equation changed overnight. Napoleon Bonaparte, desperate for cash to fund his European wars, sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States for $15 million. With a signature, 828,000 square miles changed ownership. St. Louis, which had been a French village under Spanish administration, suddenly became American. The Americans arrived with different energy. They saw the rivers not as trapping routes, but as highways for expansion. Within months, keelboats crowded the landing. These flat-bottomed vessels, propelled by poles and oars, carried settlers heading west and goods heading east. The riverfront transformed into organized chaos. Merchants shouted prices. Dock workers rolled barrels. The smell of river mud mixed with tobacco, whiskey, and sweat. By the 1820s, St. Louis had become the unavoidable gateway. Anyone heading west by river came through here. Trappers, traders, adventurers, families seeking land, all stopped to resupply before continuing up the Missouri. The general store became the institution that mattered most. Merchants who understood what the frontier needed grew wealthy. Names like the Chouteaus, who had been there from the beginning, became synonymous with power. Then the steamboat arrived. The first one reached St. Louis in 1817, belching smoke and moving upriver against the current without sails or oars. Within a decade, steamboats multiplied like a fleet. By the 1840s, the riverfront had transformed beyond recognition. Dozens of vessels lined up 3 and 4 deep along the levee, the air filled with steam whistles. Smokestacks created a permanent haze over the water. Crates and barrels stacked higher than buildings. The volume of trade exploded. The early brick buildings rose along the waterfront, substantial structures replacing the wooden shacks of earlier decades. Merchants built warehouses to hold goods flowing east and west. A commercial class emerged, men who wore fine clothes and lived in houses with multiple stories. The rough frontier settlement began showing signs of something grander. The rivers promised everything. They connected St. Louis to New Orleans and the Gulf of Mexico to the south, to the agricultural lands of the Ohio River Valley to the east, and to the unexplored territories of the Missouri River to the west. No other city sat at such a junction. No other city controlled access to so much of the continent. Geography had given St. Louis an advantage that seemed permanent. The question was whether the city could transform geographic luck into lasting power. The answer, for a brief and glorious moment, would be yes. Chapter 2: Gateway Rising. By the 1850s, St. Louis had become impossible to ignore. The city that began as a French trading post now ranked as America's 4th largest, trailing only New York, Philadelphia, and Brooklyn. More than 77,000 people lived within its boundaries, and that number climbed every year. The Mississippi riverfront stretched for miles, crowded with so many steamboats that you could barely see the water between them. On any given morning, 100. Vessels lined the levee, white paddle wheelers with elaborate gingerbread trim, flat-bottomed freight boats stacked with cotton bales, passenger packets advertising service to New Orleans or Cincinnati or Louisville. The constant churn of paddle wheels created a rhythm that never stopped. Steam whistles shrieked at all hours. Black smoke poured from tall stacks, creating a permanent smudge across the sky. The levee district operated in barely controlled chaos. Dock workers, many of them enslaved or recently freed black men, rolled barrels of molasses and hogsheads of tobacco across wooden planks. Irish immigrants unloaded crates of manufactured goods heading west. Rivermen with sun-darkened faces and rough hands shouted orders in a dozen accents. The air smelled like coal smoke, river mud, hemp rope, and spilled whiskey. Merchants conducted business on the docks themselves, closing deals worth thousands of dollars with handshakes while standing ankle-deep in Mississippi mud. The wealth flowing through the waterfront was staggering. Cotton from the Deep South moved north through St. Louis. Grain from the prairies moved south. Manufactured goods from the east moved west. Furs, lead, and raw materials from the frontier moved east. Every transaction generated fees, commissions, storage costs. The merchant class grew fat on percentages. But it was the immigrants who truly transformed the city. They arrived by the thousands, fleeing political upheaval and economic hardship in Europe. The failed German revolutions of 1848 sent waves of educated, politically radical Germans across the Atlantic. Many of them found their way up the Mississippi to St. Louis, where land was cheap and opportunity seemed boundless. The Germans settled in neighborhoods north and south of downtown, building neat brick houses with front gardens. They brought skills in brewing, baking, craftsmanship, and engineering. German became the second language of St. Louis. Entire neighborhoods operated in German, newspapers printed in German, churches conducted services in German, and they brought beer. The German brewers understood that St. Louis had everything needed for large-scale production: abundant water, caves carved into the limestone bluffs perfect for lagering, and a growing population that loved to drink. Small breweries appeared throughout the German neighborhoods: the Bavarian Brewery, the Lemp Brewery, the Anheuser Brewery, which in 1860 was struggling until a German immigrant named Adolphus Busch married the brewery owner's daughter and transformed the operation with aggressive marketing and pasteurization techniques that allowed the beer to survive long shipments. By the 1870s, St. Louis had become one of the great brewing centers of America. The beer gardens filled with families on Sunday afternoons. Music played, children ran between tables. Men argued politics over mugs of lager. This was not the rough drinking of frontier saloons, but something more civilized, more European. The culture the Germans imported gave St. Louis a sophistication that other river towns lacked. The Irish came too, driven from their homeland by famine. They took the hardest jobs, laying track for the expanding railroads, digging foundations, working the docks. They settled in tight communities, built Catholic churches, and sent their children to parochial schools. Italians arrived in smaller numbers, opening groceries and restaurants in neighborhoods south of downtown. The city's population exploded. By 1870, more than 310,000 people called St. Louis home. It had become a genuine metropolis, a place where multiple cultures collided and combined into something distinctly American, yet unlike anywhere else. Manufacturing followed commerce. The foundries came first, producing iron stoves, machinery, and tools for the expanding frontier. Factories making clothing, shoes, and processed food employed thousands. Mills processed grain. Meatpacking plants slaughtered cattle and hogs driven from the western prairies. The smoke from factory chimneys joined the smoke from steamboat stacks, creating a permanent industrial haze. The wealthy built accordingly. Merchants who had grown rich from river trade constructed mansions on the bluffs overlooking the water. Lucas Place became the most fashionable address, lined with Italianate and Second Empire homes that announced success. These were not frontier cabins, but proper city residences with marble mantels, crystal chandeliers, and servants' quarters. The merchant princes wanted the world to know that St. Louis had arrived. Cultural institutions emerged to match the economic power. The St. Louis Theater opened downtown, bringing opera and serious drama to audiences who once had only rough music halls. German singing societies performed classical music. The Mercantile Library accumulated books and paintings. Men formed exclusive clubs where deals were made over brandy and cigars. But the greatest engineering achievement of the era was still to come. James Buchanan, Eads had made his fortune salvaging sunken steamboats from the Mississippi bottom. He understood the river's power and treachery better than almost anyone alive. When civic leaders decided St. Louis needed a bridge across the Mississippi, they turned to Eads despite his lack of formal engineering training. What he proposed seemed impossible. A bridge with a central span of 520 feet, longer than any arch ever built. Constructed not of iron, but of steel, a material barely tested for such purposes. Supported by piers sunk deep into the river bottom through pneumatic caissons, a dangerous technology that killed and crippled workers. Construction began in 1867 and would take 7 years. Men worked in the caissons 100 feet below the river's surface, breathing compressed air that created excruciating pain when they surfaced too quickly. Some died, others suffered permanent paralysis from what they called the bends. Eads drove them relentlessly, convinced that his design would work if they could just execute it. The city watched the bridge take shape with a mixture of pride and anxiety. This single structure consumed more steel than any previous project in American history. If it failed, it would bankrupt the investors and humiliate the city. If it succeeded, it would prove St. Louis could accomplish what others only dreamed. On July 4th, 1874, the bridge opened. A test elephant led a parade of animals across the span to prove its strength, playing on the old superstition that elephants could sense unstable ground. Then thousands of people walked across, marveling at the view from the center of the river. The bridge stood. St. Louis had built something that would outlast everyone who created it. The city seemed unstoppable, population climbing, wealth accumulating, grand projects completed, immigrants arriving daily. The future stretched out like the rivers themselves, endless and full of promise. Chicago might be growing faster, but St. Louis had the rivers, and everyone knew that rivers were permanent in ways that railroads could never be. The belief was absolute. St. Louis would become the greatest city in America. It was only a matter of time, but Chicago, was watching, and Chicago was moving faster. Chapter 3: Gilded Ambition. Through the late 1870s and into the 1890s, the two cities locked into a rivalry that consumed civic leaders and business magnates on both sides. This was not friendly competition. This was a battle for the future of the American interior, and both cities understood that only one could win. The contest centered on railroads. The steamboat had made St. Louis great, but even the most optimistic merchants could see that rails were overtaking rivers. Trains didn't freeze in winter. They didn't depend on water levels. They could go anywhere, track could be laid. The city that controlled the most rail lines would control the commerce of the continent. Chicago had moved early. By 1880, it served as the terminal point for more than a dozen major rail lines. Tracks radiated from Chicago like spokes from a wheel, connecting to every corner of the nation. The city also had another advantage that St. Louis could never match: access to the Great Lakes. Ships could move directly from Chicago to the East Coast through the lakes and the Erie Canal, bypassing the long river route to New Orleans entirely. The numbers told an unmistakable story. Chicago's population had surged past St. Louis in the 1880 census. The gap would only widen. Grain markets shifted to Chicago. Lumber yards expanded along the Chicago River. Meatpacking plants, which had once been a St. Louis industry, relocated to Chicago's Union Stock Yards. The momentum had turned. St. Louis refused to accept second place. If Chicago built bigger, St. Louis would build grander. If Chicago grew faster, St. Louis would grow richer. The city threw itself into an architectural arms race, determined to prove through steel and stone that it remained the superior metropolis. Downtown transformed. The old brick warehouses gave way to massive commercial buildings with elaborate cast iron facades. Architects designed ornate structures dripping with decoration: cornices, columns, arched windows, decorative metalworks. Every surface announced wealth and permanence. The Wainwright Building, designed by Louis Sullivan and completed in 1891, rose 10 stories and helped define what a modern office building could be. These were not temporary structures. These were monuments meant to last centuries. The brewing industry reached heights that seemed almost absurd. Anheuser-Busch expanded relentlessly under Adolphus Busch's leadership, shipping beer across the country in refrigerated rail cars. The Lemp family built a brewery complex that sprawled across city blocks, complete with underground caves carved into the limestone. William Lemp became one of the wealthiest men in America, constructing a mansion so lavish that it required a private tunnel connecting to the brewery below. The wealthy didn't just build homes, they created entire private enclaves. Lafayette Park, established in the 1840s, became ringed with Second Empire and Italianate mansions. But even more exclusive were the private places, gated streets owned collectively by the residents who could control who entered. Portland Place, Westmoreland Place, Van Deventer Place. These tree-lined boulevards featured the grandest homes in the city, each trying to outdo its neighbor in opulence. Inside these mansions, the Gilded Age expressed itself in crystal and gold. Ballrooms with parquet floors and mirrored walls, libraries paneled in imported wood, conservatories filled with exotic plants, servants' wings that housed staffs of a dozen or more. The industrialists and merchants who controlled St. Louis's economy lived like aristocrats, hosting elaborate dinners and charity balls where fortunes were displayed as casually as the weather was discussed. Private clubs proliferated. The Noonday Club, the St. Louis Club, the Mercantile Club. Each had its own building, its own leather chairs, its own hierarchy of members. Business was conducted in these rooms as much as in any office. Membership meant access to the networks that actually controlled the city. But beneath the gilt surface, tensions simmered. In July 1877, railroad workers went on strike after companies announced wage cuts. What began as a labor dispute in the East quickly spread west. In St. Louis, the strike escalated into something close to an insurrection. Workers from multiple industries joined the railroad men. For several days, strikers controlled portions of the city. Factories shut down, trains stopped running. Violence erupted between strikers and police. The business elite watched in horror as their workers turned against them. Governor John Phelps sent in federal troops to break the strike. The confrontation ended with arrests, broken unions, and a hardening of class divisions. The incident revealed that St. Louis's prosperity had not been shared equally. The men who lived in mansions around Lafayette Park and the men who worked in the foundries and rail yards inhabited different worlds, and those worlds were beginning to collide. Yet, civic pride demanded that such unpleasantness be pushed aside. St. Louis had a reputation to maintain, an image to project. In 1876, the city established Forest Park on land west of the developed areas. Measuring 1,371 acres, it dwarfed New York's Central Park. The park featured wooded areas, meadows, lakes, and drives designed for carriage rides. It was a statement of permanence, a declaration that St. Louis was building for the ages. The psychological need to prove superiority became almost desperate. Chicago had recovered from its devastating 1871 fire and seemed to grow stronger every year. St. Louis merchants and civic leaders couldn't accept being surpassed. They needed something spectacular, something that would announce to the world that St. Louis remained relevant, powerful, and destined for greatness. The idea emerged gradually through the 1890s. Other cities had hosted World's Fairs. Chicago had held one in 1893 to commemorate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage. The fair had been a triumph, drawing 27 million visitors and establishing Chicago's cultural credentials. St. Louis needed something bigger. In 1901, civic leaders began planning an exposition to celebrate the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase. It would be held in Forest Park. It would showcase American progress and St. Louis's central role in the nation's expansion. It would be the largest, most elaborate fair ever created. The planning consumed the city's elite. Committees formed. Designs were commissioned, money was raised. The fair would require millions of dollars and years of construction. Some questioned whether St. Louis could afford such extravagance. The doubters were ignored. This fair would prove, once and for all, that St. Louis had not been eclipsed, that the gateway to the West remained the most important city in the American interior, that Chicago's growth meant nothing compared to St. Louis's history, culture, and vision. The exposition would open in 1904. The entire world would come to St. Louis, and everyone would finally see what the city's leaders had always known, that St. Louis was exceptional, permanent, and destined to stand among the greatest cities on earth. What they couldn't see was that they were planning the city's funeral. Chapter 4: The Great Fair. On April 30th, 1904, President Theodore Roosevelt pressed a golden telegraph key in Washington, and in St. Louis, machinery roared to life. Fountains erupted, flags unfurled. A cascade of electric lights blazed across 1,200 acres of Forest Park. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition had opened, and it was the largest, most elaborate fair the world had ever seen. The scale defied comprehension. 15 main palaces rose. Across the fairgrounds, each one massive enough to dwarf most civic buildings. The Palace of Varied Industries stretched longer than 3 football fields. The Palace of Liberal Arts contained 11 acres under a single roof. These structures were designed in the Beaux Arts style, all classical columns and ornate domes, painted ivory white so they gleamed in the sunlight like ancient temples. At the center of it all lay the Grand Basin, a rectangular lake measuring 1,400 feet long and 600 feet wide. Festival Hall anchored the northern end, its dome visible for miles. Water cascaded down terraced fountains. Sculptures of classical figures gazed across the water. At night, colored electric lights transformed the scene into something that seemed pulled from fantasy. Visitors who had never seen electric illumination on such a scale stood speechless as thousands of bulbs traced the outlines of buildings and reflected off the water. The fair had been delayed a year from its planned 1903 opening because the construction couldn't be completed in time. Even with the extra year, workers were still painting and installing exhibits on opening day. But none of that mattered once the gates opened. People came from across America and around the world. They arrived by train, by steamboat, by horse, and wagon. Over the next 7 months, nearly 20 million visitors would pass through the turnstiles. Walking through the fairgrounds felt like touring the entire world in a single afternoon. Pavilions from 43 states and more than 60 countries lined the avenues. Japan had built an authentic garden with a pagoda and ceremonial tea house. France displayed artwork in a building modeled after the Grand Trianon at Versailles. The German pavilion served beer and German food. Great Britain showed off its manufacturing prowess. But the true heart of the fair's entertainment was the Pike, a mile-long midway that stretched from the main entrance like a river of noise and spectacle. Here, the high-minded educational mission of the fair gave way to pure amusement. Hundreds of concessions competed for attention. The creation showed a mechanical recreation of the biblical Genesis. The hereafter promised a journey through the afterlife. A Tyrolean Alps exhibit featured actual Swiss performers in an artificial mountain setting. Food vendors discovered what people wanted when freed from the constraints of home cooking. The ice cream cone, though not actually invented at the fair, was popularized here when ice cream vendors ran out of dishes and began serving scoops and rolled waffle pastries. Hot dogs, sausages served in long rolls, became the fair's most popular quick meal. Dr. Pepper, a relatively new soft drink, gained national recognition from its aggressive marketing at the exposition. St. Louis had also won the honor of hosting the Olympic Games, held simultaneously with the fair from July through November. These were the first Olympics on American soil, though they bore little resemblance to the modern games. Events stretched over months rather than weeks. Many competitions drew only American athletes, but it added to the sense that the world's attention had focused entirely on St. Louis for this one miraculous summer. At night, the fair became otherworldly. The electric illumination used more power than many entire cities. Visitors walked through pools of colored light. Buildings glowed against the dark sky. The cascading fountains sparkled with thousands of reflected bulbs. Orchestra music drifted across the grounds from bandstands and pavilions. The air smelled of popcorn, flowers, and the faint smoke of the coal that powered the generators. For St. Louis's civic leaders, this was the ultimate vindication. The world had come to them. Every visitor who marveled at the palaces, every newspaper that praised the exposition, every dignitary who attended, it all proved that St. Louis had achieved greatness. The city had spent more than $15 million creating this spectacle, but it seemed worth every penny. This was the moment St. Louis announced its permanence. But beneath the white palaces and electric lights lurked something darker. The fair's organizers had designed an entire section devoted to what they called anthropology. In truth, it was a human zoo. Villages had been constructed to display indigenous peoples from around the world, performing their primitive customs for gawking crowds. Filipinos, recently conquered in America's war against Spain, were exhibited in constructed villages. Geronimo, the legendary Apache warrior who had spent the last years of his life as a prisoner, was brought to the fair to sell photographs and autographs, a living symbol of the conquered frontier. The anthropology department arranged people in hierarchies meant to demonstrate racial theories about human evolution. African pygmies were displayed alongside Native Americans and Pacific Islanders. Fair literature described these exhibits as educational, showing the progression from savage to civilized. In reality, they were degrading spectacles that treated human beings as curiosities, reinforcing the racist ideologies that justified American imperialism. The message was explicit. The Louisiana Purchase had opened the continent to American expansion. That expansion had been violent, displacing and destroying indigenous populations. And now, at the turn of the century, America was expanding overseas, taking possession of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam. The fair celebrated this conquest as progress, as the natural order of superior civilizations subduing inferior ones. Most white visitors saw nothing wrong with these exhibits. They moved from the Philippine village to the Tyrolean Alps to the Japanese garden without recognizing the fundamental difference in how these peoples were being presented. The Filipinos were displayed as primitive specimens. The Europeans were celebrated as cultural achievements. The fair captured America at a particular moment, confident in its power and certain of its righteousness. St. Louis had positioned itself at the center of that narrative, the gateway through which American expansion had flowed westward and through which American influence now spread globally. But the glory was temporary. The fair had been designed to last just 7 months. On December 1st, 1904, the gates closed for the final time. Within weeks, workers began dismantling the ivory palaces. The structures had been built of staff, a mixture of plaster and fiber that looked like marble, but was never meant to endure. Some buildings were sold for scrap, others were simply demolished. Festival Hall survived until 1909 before it too was torn down. The Grand Basin was drained, the Pike was cleared. Forest Park returned to being a park, though scarred by the construction and stripped of many of its old trees. Visitors who returned a year after the fair closed would barely recognize this landscape. St. Louis was left with memories, photographs, and crushing debt. The exposition had cost far more than anticipated and earned far less. The city had borrowed heavily to finance construction, believing that gate receipts would cover the expenses. They didn't. The debt would burden the city's finances for years. More troubling were the subtle signs that something had shifted. During the months of the fair, railroad traffic had declined. Businessmen noticed that trade patterns were continuing to favor Chicago. The population growth that had seemed inevitable began to slow. The industries that had built St. Louis's wealth were facing new competition from cities with better rail access and lower costs. None of this seemed important in the immediate afterglow of the fair. Civic leaders proclaimed the exposition an unqualified success. Newspapers praised the city's achievement. The 20 million visitors were cited as proof of St. Louis's importance. But the fair had been a performance, not a foundation. The ivory palaces were plaster. The electric lights had been temporary. The moment of global attention had passed. And beneath the surface, the forces that would hollow out St. Louis were already at work. The fair marked the peak. Though no one realized it at the time, St. Louis would never again command the world's attention. The population would never grow as fast. The confidence would never feel as absolute. In hindsight, the 1904 World's Fair looks less like a beginning and more like an elaborate farewell, a final flourish before the long decline began. Chapter 5: Monuments to Forever. The fair ended, but the building did not. St. Louis continued constructing monuments as if the future were guaranteed. The U.S. city's leaders believed they were building for centuries, creating infrastructure and architecture that would serve generations yet unborn. Every cornerstone laid, every foundation poured, carried the weight of absolute confidence. Union Station stood as the greatest symbol of that confidence. Opened in 1894, it had grown into one of the busiest railroad terminals in the world by the early 1900s. More than 100,000 passengers passed through daily at its peak. Trains arrived from every direction, connecting St. Louis to both coasts and every major city in between. The terminal building itself was a masterpiece of Richardsonian, Romanesque design. The Grand Hall rose 65 feet to a barrel-vaulted ceiling, decorated with ornate plasterwork and gold leaf. Limestone walls supported arched windows that filled the space with natural light. The most famous feature was the Whispering Arch in the main corridor, where two people standing at opposite corners could hear each other whisper across the vast space, the curved ceiling carrying sound in ways that seemed almost magical. Walking through Union Station meant walking through the future. Businessmen hurried toward platforms with leather cases full of contracts. Families arrived from the east to start new lives in the west. Soldiers shipped out to distant posts. The constant motion, the echoing announcements, the hiss of steam and screech of brakes, it all testified to St. Louis's role as the continent's crossroads. Construction continued throughout the city, on an equally grand scale. In 1907, Archbishop John Glennon laid the cornerstone for what would become the Cathedral Basilica of St. Louis. The design called for Byzantine-style domes and one of the largest mosaic installations in the world. The project would take decades to complete, but that was the point. This was not a building meant for one generation, but for the ages. City Hall rose downtown in the Beaux-Arts style, all classical columns and elaborate stonework. The central library opened with reading rooms paneled in oak and ceilings painted with allegorical scenes representing knowledge and enlightenment. These buildings made statements not just about the present, but about the city's vision of its eternal importance. The downtown commercial district expanded block by block. Department stores, Famous Bar, Scruggs, Van der Voort, Barney, Styx, Bear, and Fuller competed to offer the finest goods in the most elegant settings. Office towers reached higher, banks built in granite and marble to project solidity and trust. Infrastructure investments matched the architectural ambition. The city laid hundreds of miles of streetcar track, creating a web of transit that connected every neighborhood to the center. Water and sewer systems were expanded and modernized. Electric power lines spread across the grid. Parks were improved and expanded. Everything was designed with growth in mind, with the assumption that the city would continue needing more capacity, more space, more of everything. The wealthy built their mansions with the same long view. These were not houses meant to last a single lifetime, but family seats meant to pass through generations. Ballrooms were sized for the weddings of grandchildren not yet born. Libraries were built to house collections that would grow for decades. Servants' wings anticipated staffs that would serve the family name across time. The psychological commitment to permanence ran so deep that warnings were dismissed or ignored. Some businessmen noticed that railroad routes increasingly favored Chicago's more central location. Manufacturing plants began opening in smaller cities where land and labor cost less. The population growth that had seemed unstoppable began to slow, though the absolute numbers still climbed. These cracks were subtle at first. A factory closing here, a corporate headquarters relocating there, shipping volumes that plateaued rather than increased. None of it seemed alarming in isolation. St. Louis remained wealthy, important, and growing. The buildings rising downtown proclaimed that nothing fundamental had changed, but the overconfidence had become dangerous. The city's leaders had built their entire vision around assumptions that seemed unshakable, that rivers would always matter, that St. Louis's geographic position guaranteed prosperity, that the momentum of the past would carry automatically into the future. They had built Union Station for a railroad age that was already beginning to shift. They had invested in river infrastructure when the future belonged to highways not yet imagined. The monuments they were raising would outlast the prosperity that created them. These buildings were designed to serve a city of millions. They would instead become reminders of what had been lost, grand shells occupied by a fraction of their intended population. The building continued through the 1910s and into the 1920s, each project reinforcing the illusion that St. Louis remained ascendant. Cathedral construction proceeded slowly but steadily, the mosaics being installed piece by tiny piece. More office. Towers rose downtown. The civic architecture grew more elaborate, as if grandeur alone could guarantee relevance. But the forces working against the city were gathering strength. The moment of reckoning was coming. Chapter 6: The Breaking. July 6, 1917, dawned hot and humid across the Mississippi River Valley. By the time the sun set that evening, East St. Louis would be burning, and the bodies of black men, women, and children would be lying in the streets. The violence began early in the day. White mobs, some numbering in the hundreds, moved through the predominantly black neighborhoods of East St. Louis. They dragged people from streetcars and beat them. They set fire to homes and shot those who fled the flames. They hunted human beings through the streets of an American city in broad daylight, while police stood by or joined in. The scope of the killing remains uncertain even now. Official reports claimed 40 deaths. Witnesses reported hundreds. Bodies were thrown into Cahokia Creek or buried in unmarked graves. Some victims were never counted, never identified, never mourned publicly. Thousands of black residents fled across the river to St. Louis or scattered to other cities, carrying only what they could grab before the mobs reached their homes. The causes had been building for months. Black workers had been recruited from the South to work in East St. Louis factories, part of the Great Migration that saw hundreds of thousands of African Americans leave the Deep South, seeking better opportunities in northern cities. Their arrival threatened white workers who feared competition for jobs and housing. Unions, which excluded black members, stoked resentment. Real estate interests worried about property values in white neighborhoods. The violence that erupted was not spontaneous. It was the result of deliberate agitation, racist propaganda, and the willingness of white residents to believe that black neighbors represented a threat rather than fellow human beings, seeking the same opportunities they themselves desired. The horror of what happened in East St. Louis shocked the nation. Newspapers across the country ran front-page stories describing the atrocities. Civil rights organizations condemned the violence. The NAACP organized a silent march in New York, where thousands walked down Fifth Avenue in protest. The nation's eyes turned to the St. Louis region and saw something shameful. Though East St. Louis was technically in Illinois, it was part of the greater St. Louis metropolitan area. The stains spread across the river. The city that had just 13 years earlier hosted the world with the grandest fair in history now became associated with racial terrorism. The psychological impact would linger for decades. Migration patterns began to shift. Black families who might have considered St. Louis looked elsewhere. White families with means began thinking about leaving the urban core. The optimism that had defined the city for generations started to curdle into anxiety. The 1920s brought new troubles. The population still grew, but the rate slowed dramatically. The city that had added tens of thousands annually now struggled to match previous decades. More concerning, the growth that did occur was happening in the suburbs, not the urban center. Then came Prohibition in 1920, and with it the near destruction of St. Louis's brewing industry. Anheuser-Busch survived by producing non-alcoholic beverages, malt syrup, and ice cream, but dozens of smaller breweries closed permanently. Thousands of jobs vanished. The German beer gardens that had given the city so much of its cultural character shut their doors. An entire industry that had helped define St. Louis simply disappeared. The Great Depression struck in 1929 like a hammer blow to a structure already weakened. Banks failed across the city. Factories that had employed thousands shut down or drastically reduced operations. The unemployment rate soared above 20%. Breadlines formed in the shadows of the grand civic buildings, erected just decades before. Union Station began its long decline. The number of trains decreased year by year. The Grand Terminal that had once seen 100,000 passengers daily now echoed with emptiness. Fewer people traveled, fewer companies shipped by rail. The building that had symbolized St. Louis's centrality now stood as evidence of its fading relevance. The psychological shift was profound. A generation had grown up believing St. Louis would inevitably grow larger, richer, more important. Now their children watched businesses close and neighbors move away. The confidence that had driven the construction of monuments gave way to a creeping anxiety that perhaps the best days had already passed. World War II brought temporary revival. Defense contracts filled factories. The population stabilized as workers arrived for war production jobs. But this proved to be a last gasp rather than a renewal. The moment the war ended, the real acceleration of decline began. The suburbs had existed before the war, small satellite communities connected to the city by streetcar and rail. After 1945, they exploded. Returning veterans used government-backed mortgages to buy homes in Clayton, Ladue, Webster Groves, and dozens of other communities ringing the city. These new suburbs were almost exclusively white, their racial homogeneity enforced through restrictive covenants, redlining by banks, and the open racism of real estate agents. The families leaving were the middle class, the tax base, the people who had filled the department stores and supported the cultural institutions. As they departed, they took their resources with them. The city's revenue declined while its infrastructure costs remained high. The death spiral had begun. Then came the highways. The new interstate highway system, launched in 1956, was promoted as modern progress. In St. Louis, it became a weapon of destruction. Engineers drew lines through the heart of established neighborhoods. Entire blocks were demolished to make room for concrete ribbons that allowed suburban commuters to drive into downtown offices and back out again without ever engaging with the city around them. Interstate 70 cut through the northern part of the city. Interstate 64 sliced across the center. Interstate 55 carved through the south. Neighborhoods that had existed for generations were obliterated. The highways didn't connect St. Louis to the outside world, so much as they connected the suburbs to each other, making the city itself optional. Urban renewal, sold as salvation, accelerated the destruction. Entire districts of historic buildings were demolished and replaced with parking lots and modernist structures that ignored the context around them. The DeSoto Carr neighborhood, one of the oldest in the city, was largely erased. Blocks near the riverfront were cleared. The justification was always the same. These areas were blighted, obsolete, obstacles to progress. What replaced them was worse. The grand architecture of the 19th century gave way to sterile boxes. The density and street life that had made urban neighborhoods vibrant was replaced with empty plazas and parking, garages. The city was being remade by planners who seemed to believe that the future had no use for the past. By 1950, the population peaked at 856,000. The decline that followed was not gradual, it was catastrophic. Within a decade, tens of thousands had fled. Within 2 decades, the city had lost more than a quarter of its population. The emptying had begun, and nothing could stop it. Chapter 7: The Hollow Core. The numbers tell a story of collapse so complete it seems almost impossible. In 1950, St. Louis reached its population peak, 856,000 residents. 30 years later, in 1980, only 453,000 remained. The city had lost nearly half its population in a single generation. But numbers don't capture what it meant to watch your city empty around you, to walk past homes that once held families, now boarded and silent, to see your neighborhood school close, your corner grocery shut down, your church congregation dwindle to a handful too stubborn or too poor to leave. The white middle class fled first and fastest. The suburbs offered everything the city seemed to lack: new houses with yards, good schools, low crime, separation from the black residents they feared or despised. Federal housing policies actively encouraged this segregation through redlining, marking predominantly black neighborhoods in red ink, and refusing to insure mortgages there. Banks wouldn't lend. Developers wouldn't build. These areas were marked for abandonment. The highways made escape easier. Interstate 70 cut through the north. Interstate 64 sliced across the center. Interstate 55 carved through the south. You could live in Ladue or Clayton, work downtown, and never engage with urban life. The morning commute brought a flood of cars into the city. Evening emptied it again. The highways became evacuation routes. Loss of the tax base created a death spiral. As the middle class departed, city revenue collapsed. Services were cut. Police and fire departments operated with reduced staff. Street maintenance was deferred. Parks fell into disrepair. The schools, dependent on local property taxes, deteriorated rapidly. Families who remained watched their children's schools lose funding, lose teachers, lose hope. Buildings decayed. Those who could afford to leave did so, reducing funding further, making schools worse, driving more families away. The cycle fed on itself, accelerating with each turn. Crime rose as opportunity vanished. Young men who might have found factory work a generation earlier faced unemployment and poverty. The social fabric unraveled. Each problem drove more residents away, which worsened every problem. The most visible symbol of failure rose on the near north side in the mid-1950s. Pruitt Ego was conceived as modernist salvation, a clean alternative to slum housing. Architect Minoru Yamasaki, who would later design the World Trade Center, created 33 11-story buildings housing nearly 3,000 families. The towers opened in 1954 with optimism. The design, elegant in architectural drawings, proved catastrophic in reality. No air conditioning in St. Louis's brutal summers. Elevators constantly broke. Long corridors became dangerous spaces where crime flourished. Maintenance was inadequate from the start. Within years, the complex had become a nightmare of broken windows, graffiti, violence, and despair. By the late 1960s, entire buildings stood vacant. Residents who could leave did. Those who remained were the poorest of the poor, trapped in towers that had become vertical slums, worse than the horizontal ones they replaced. In 1972, less than 20 years after opening, the city began demolishing Pruitt Ego. The implosion of the first building was broadcast nationally. The footage became an iconic symbol of failed urban planning, of good intentions producing horror. The cleared land remained empty for decades, a vast scar, a monument to failure. Downtown emptied in parallel. The grand department stores began closing. Famous bar consolidated. Smaller stores simply shut their doors. Sidewalks that had been crowded with shoppers grew quiet. By the 1970s, you could stand on a downtown corner during a weekday afternoon and see more pigeons than people. Office buildings emptied as companies relocated to suburban parks. Towers that had proclaimed commercial vitality now had entire floors vacant, windows dark, lobbies echoing. Union Station, once among the world's busiest terminals, became hollow. Amtrak's formation in 1971 reduced passenger rail to a fraction of former scale. Where 100,000 had once passed through daily, now a few hundred arrived on a handful of trains. The grand waiting hall stood mostly empty. The brewing industry contracted. Smaller breweries closed. Anheuser-Busch survived but employed a fraction of workers the industry once had. The beer gardens were long gone. The Gilded Age mansions met different fates. Some were demolished for parking lots, others subdivided into apartments, their ballrooms partitioned into bedrooms. A few survived intact, but most simply decayed. Windows boarded, roofs leaked, ornate plasterwork crumbled. Walking through 1970s downtown meant navigating abandonment, boarded windows, empty storefronts, parking lots where buildings had stood. The streets were eerily quiet. Infrastructure built for hundreds of thousands now served tens of thousands. It felt post-apocalyptic. For those who remained, the psychological trauma was immense. They were watching their city die in slow motion, powerless to stop it. Every closed school, every demolished building, every departing neighbor was another small death. Yet, throughout this catastrophic decline, through the 1950s and 1960s, one enormous project proceeded. While the city emptied and burned and collapsed, workers were building the Gateway Arch on the riverfront. The contrast between the monument rising and the city falling created a surreal juxtaposition. The arch would be completed in 1965, at the midpoint of St. Louis's collapse. It would stand as the city's most recognizable symbol, visible for miles, drawing tourists from around the world, and it would preside over ruins. Chapter 8: A Monument in Decline. In 1947, as St. Louis began its long slide from prominence, civic leaders conceived a monument to westward expansion. The irony was lost on them. They would build a memorial celebrating the city's role as gateway to the West, at the precise moment when that role had become historical fiction rather than living reality. The National Park Service announced a design competition. Architects from across the country submitted proposals for a memorial on the Mississippi riverfront. Among them was a Finnish-American architect named Eero Saarinen, who proposed something radical: a massive stainless steel arch, 630 feet tall, rising above the river like a geometric rainbow. What happened next became architectural legend. Eero's father, Eliel Saarinen, had also entered the competition with a more conventional design. When officials prepared to announce the winner, they sent a telegram to Saarinen, congratulating him on his victory. Eliel received it first and began celebrating. The celebration was brief. Within hours, officials realized their mistake. The winner was the son, not the father. The embarrassing correction had to be made. Eliel graciously stepped aside, though the confusion must have stung. But winning the competition didn't mean the arch would be built quickly. Funding problems plagued the project from the start. Congress had to approve appropriations. Local fundraising fell short of goals. Political battles erupted over control and oversight. Years passed with nothing but drawings and models. The real controversy came with the land clearance. To create the memorial grounds, 40 blocks of the riverfront would have to be demolished. This was the oldest part of St. Louis, where the French had first settled, where the 19th century commercial district had thrived. Historic buildings that had survived the Civil War, the 1896 tornado, and the Great Depression were marked for destruction. Opponents argued for preservation. The buildings represented irreplaceable history, but the vision of the memorial won out. Between 1939 and 1942, entire blocks were razed. Warehouses, hotels, commercial buildings, all reduced to rubble. The neighborhoods where immigrants had first made their homes vanished beneath bulldozers. What remained was cleared land waiting for a monument that wouldn't begin construction for nearly 2 decades. Finally, in 1961, work began. The engineering challenge was immense. The arch would be built from both legs simultaneously, each side rising independently until they met at the top. The structure used a triangular cross-section, wider at the base and tapering toward the apex. The skin was double-walled stainless steel with concrete fill for stability and strength. Workers assembled the arch in sections, each piece hoisted into place and welded to those below. As the legs rose higher, the work became increasingly dangerous. Men worked hundreds of feet above the ground with the Mississippi River below. Wind buffeted the open structure. One miscalculation, one structural failure, and the entire project could collapse catastrophically. The legs rose through 1963, 1964, and into 1965. The gap between them narrowed. Engineers worried about thermal expansion. If the south-facing leg heated too much in the sun, it might expand enough to prevent the final section from fitting. Construction was scheduled for early morning, when temperatures would be most stable. On October 28, 1965, a crowd gathered to watch the final piece placed. The triangular keystone section was lifted by helicopter and carefully maneuvered into position. It fit. Workers secured it with bolts. The arch was complete. Hidden inside that keystone was a time capsule containing signatures from over 500,000 schoolchildren from across the country, their names sealed into the monument's highest point. A gesture toward the future from a city losing its present. The interior tram system opened in 1967, allowing visitors to ride to the top in small capsules that traveled up the curved interior of each leg. The view from the observation deck stretched for miles. You could see the Mississippi flowing north and south. You could see Illinois to the east and Missouri to the west. And directly below, you could see a city that was shrinking. Security protocols established that presidents would not be allowed to ascend the arch due to Secret Service concerns about the confined space and limited escape routes. But when Dwight Eisenhower visited in 1967, he insisted on making the journey. They couldn't refuse a former president, and Eisenhower rode to the top, looking out over a city he barely recognized from his earlier visits. The arch became instantly iconic. Photographers captured its elegant curve from every angle. It appeared on postcards, souvenirs, and promotional materials. It gave St. Louis a symbol recognized worldwide, but it didn't reverse the decline. Tourists came to see the arch, rode to the top, bought souvenirs, and left. Few ventured into the emptying downtown or explored the struggling neighborhoods. The monument became a destination unto itself, isolated from the dying city around it. On November 22, 1980, a parachutist named Kenneth Swires illegally climbed to the top of the arch and jumped. His plan was to parachute to the ground and escape before security could respond. But during the descent, his parachute malfunctioned. He struck the arch on the way down. His body was found at the base. The arch had claimed its only fatality, a death as senseless as the city's decline. The Gateway Arch stands as the perfect symbol of St. Louis, a monument to westward expansion built when that expansion had long since passed beyond the city. A memorial to Gateway status constructed as that status evaporated, a gleaming steel curve rising above ruins, attracting visitors to a city they otherwise ignore. The arch proclaims permanence while presiding over abandonment. It was meant to announce St. Louis's enduring importance. Instead, it marks the place where importance once resided and then departed, leaving only the monument behind. Chapter 9: What Remains. Today, St. Louis holds approximately 300,000 residents. The city, built for 856,000, now operates at barely a third of its intended capacity. The infrastructure designed for multitudes serves a remnant. Grand boulevards carry light traffic. Neighborhoods planned for thousands house hundreds. The gap between what was built and what remains creates a physical manifestation of loss. The city consistently ranks among the most dangerous in America. Crime statistics place it at or near the top of national murder rates year after year. The reasons are complex: poverty, segregation, lack of opportunity, the concentrated despair of communities abandoned by capital and hope. But the numbers tell their own brutal story about a city where violence has become endemic. Driving through downtown, the contrast strikes immediately. The Gateway Arch gleams in stainless perfection, its curve as clean as the day it opened. But walk 3 blocks in any direction, and you encounter a different reality. Boarded windows, empty storefronts, buildings slowly surrendering to decay. The juxtaposition is jarring, almost obscene. The monument proclaims triumph while surrounded by evidence of defeat. Some of the grand buildings survived. Union Station, that magnificent terminal that once processed 100,000 passengers daily, was converted in the 1980s into a hotel and shopping complex. The Grand Hall still impresses with its barrel-vaulted ceiling and whispering arch, but it's a shadow of its former purpose, a gutted monument repurposed into something it was never meant to be. Tourists wander through, take photos, and move on. The building endures, but its soul departed with the last great trains. The Fox Theater stands as a triumph of preservation. This 1929 movie palace, with its Byzantine-inspired interior and elaborate plasterwork, was saved from demolition in the 1970s and restored to its original splendor. It hosts Broadway tours and concerts. On show nights, it fills with audiences who marvel at the craftsmanship. But the Fox is an exception, kept alive through constant fundraising and volunteer effort. a beautiful anomaly in a landscape of loss. Forest Park, that vast green space established in 1876 and expanded for the 1904 World's Fair, remains genuinely beautiful. Its museums, zoo, and grounds are well maintained. Families picnic on the lawns, joggers circle the paths. For a few hours, you can forget the surrounding decline. But drive beyond the park's boundaries and the contrast reasserts itself. The beauty is real, but it's isolated, a preserve of culture surrounded by abandonment. The brewing legacy that once defined St. Louis ended not with closure, but with sale. In 2008, Anheuser-Busch, the last great brewery born in the city's German immigrant neighborhoods, was sold to the Belgian-Brazilian conglomerate InBev. The company remained headquartered in St. Louis, and the brewery still operates, but control had passed to foreign ownership. The industry that August Busch and Adolphus Busch had built across generations was now managed from offices in Belgium and Brazil. Baseball survives. The Cardinals remain one of the city's few genuinely thriving institutions, filling their stadium on summer nights with fans who still believe in something. The team's success provides a rallying point, a source of shared pride in a city with few other sources. But even this is telling. St. Louis's civic identity now centers on a sports team rather than commerce, culture, or industry. Small pockets of gentrification have emerged. Lafayette Square, where Gilded Age mansions once housed the city's elite, has seen restoration. Young professionals have moved in, renovating the old houses, opening cafes and boutiques. Soulard, the old French neighborhood near the brewery, has likewise attracted investment. These neighborhoods show what's possible with money and commitment, but they're tiny islands in an ocean of decline. For every restored block, there are dozens that continue deteriorating. North St. Louis tells the fuller story. Drive through these neighborhoods and you encounter street after street of vacant homes. Not a few scattered empties, but entire blocks where more houses are abandoned than occupied. Brick structures that were built to last centuries now collapse slowly, roofs cave in, windows are shattered, vines crawl across facades. The buildings remain standing long enough to rot, their decay visible and prolonged. The psychological weight of living in such a city is difficult to convey. St. Louis is defined not by what it is, but by what it lost. Every conversation about the city's present eventually circles back to its past. The 1904 World's Fair, the population peak, the manufacturing heyday, the glory days. Residents live in the shadow of their grandparents' city, surrounded by infrastructure that was built for a different reality. Tourists come for the arch. Some venture to a Cardinals game. Most leave without engaging with anything else. They see this monument, snap photos, and drive back to the airport. They don't explore the neighborhoods. They don't eat in local restaurants. They don't stay overnight. The arch has become a roadside attraction, drawing visitors who treat the city as a brief stop rather than a destination. The region's fragmentation compounds every problem. In 1876, St. Louis City separated from St. Louis County, creating independent jurisdictions. That decision, made during the confident years when growth seemed inevitable, has become a curse. The county and the surrounding municipalities each guard their own tax bases. There's no regional cooperation, no shared sacrifice, no collective vision. The city bears the costs of poverty and infrastructure, while the wealthy suburbs keep their resources for themselves. Attempts at revival appear periodically. A new development is announced. Tax incentives are offered. Ribbons are cut at groundbreakings. Sometimes the projects are completed. More often they stall or fail entirely. Nothing quite takes hold. Nothing reverses the fundamental dynamic. The cycle of decline continues. What remains is the sadness of grandeur without purpose. The city hall, built for a government serving 856,000, now serves 300,000. The central library, magnificent in its Beaux-Arts splendor, sits in a downtown where few people live or work. Union Station's Grand Hall echoes with the footsteps of hotel guests rather than travelers rushing to catch trains. The infrastructure of ambition persists, occupied by a fraction of its intended population, monuments to what was promised but never sustained. The buildings endure longer than the dreams that created them, and their endurance makes the loss more visible, more painful, more impossible to ignore. Chapter 10: The Gateway to Nothing. The arc of St. Louis traces a perfect curve of American ambition, from promise to peak to collapse. Few cities rose so high on such certain foundations. Fewer still have fallen so far. The story teaches uncomfortable lessons about cities and the forces that shape them. Geography mattered until it didn't. The rivers that guaranteed St. Louis's prominence for a century became irrelevant the moment railroads could go anywhere and highways could bypass the urban core entirely. The advantage that seemed permanent proved temporary. Location was destiny until technology rendered location negotiable. The 1904 World's Fair marked the summit, the moment of maximum confidence before the fall. 20 million visitors came to witness St. Louis announce its permanence. The ivory palaces proclaimed a future that would never arrive. The fair was not a beginning, but an end, a final flourish before the long descent. The racial violence and segregation poisoned what remained. The East St. Louis massacre of 1917 stained the region's reputation and accelerated the departures that would hollow the city. The redlining, the white flight, the systematic abandonment of black neighborhoods, these weren't accidents of decline, but engines of it, deliberate choices that fragmented the city beyond repair. No monument could prevent the suburban exodus. The Gateway Arch rose as the city fell, a perfect symbol, soaring ambition with a hollow center, standing over the ruins of the city that built it. The gateway to the west became a gateway to nothing, a steel curve marking an empty promise. What was lost wasn't just population, but civic cohesion, shared purpose, the belief that the city's fate mattered to everyone within it. The buildings remain, Union Station, City Hall, the grand commercial blocks, but the spirit that created them vanished. They stand as elaborate tombstones marking the death of an idea. Other industrial cities declined, Cleveland, Detroit, Buffalo, but St. Louis's fall carries unique tragedy. Those cities were always gritty, industrial, working class. St. Louis had seemed destined for something grander. It rivaled Chicago for supremacy over the American interior. It hosted the world. It built monuments meant to last 1,000 years. Chicago won, St. Louis lost, completely. At sunset, the Gateway Arch catches the light, its stainless steel glowing orange and gold above the Mississippi. The monument endures while the dream it represents lies dead in the streets below. Tourists stand beneath the arch, crane their necks to follow its curve into the sky, then look out at blocks of abandonment stretching in every direction. St. Louis proves that even the most promising cities can fade, that grand plans and great architecture cannot save a city from larger forces. That confidence, no matter how absolute, offers no protection against obsolescence. The tragedy isn't the decline itself. Cities rise and fall, economies shift. The tragedy is the scale of what was lost, from America's fourth largest city to a cautionary tale in 150 years. The visitor stands under the arch, feeling small beneath the engineered curve, and sees both what was built and what was abandoned. The gateway stands, perfect and permanent. But to what?